Let's turn today to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 6 and verse 16. As we have been studying in these past few sessions, the first 18 verses of chapter 6 deal with not seeking the honor of men in our spiritual activities, whether it's righteousness, giving money, praying, or here, fasting. Whatever religious activity we engage in, the important thing is that we do it for the glory of God. That is what gives it spiritual value. In fact, 1 Corinthians 10:31 says that even if we eat or drink, this must be done for the glory of God. It is not the activity itself that makes something spiritual. You can have a religious activity, but it may not be spiritual. A person can sing or preach or give money for his own honor. What he is engaged in is a religious activity, but it's not a spiritual work because it was done for his own honor. Whereas a person can eat and drink, and that can be a spiritual activity because it is done for the glory of God. In the Old Testament, they had certain activities that were religious and certain activities that were secular. But in the New Covenant, everything, whether you eat or drink, everything must be for the glory of God. Jesus made stools and benches in the carpenter shop for the glory of God as much as he healed the sick and preached sermons. And so the important thing we must remember, dear friends, is not the activity, but the motive behind the activity. Not what we do, why do we do it? And this is particularly important in religious activities, because in religious activities there is the possibility of our getting a lot of honor from men for being spiritual. Ananias and Sapphira got honor. They were judged for being hypocrites. In this area of fasting, there is no command in the New Testament which says that we must fast. Jesus did say in Luke 18 verse 1 that we must always pray, but he never said anywhere that we must fast. But it is suggested in 1 Corinthians 7, it's suggested in Matthew 17 as a means for casting out particularly strong evil spirits. And so it's something which is optional and something which must be done according to one's own desire and burden. But what the Lord did say is, when you do fast, make sure that nobody outside your home knows about it. We can't perhaps prevent people from inside our home knowing about it, but don't do it in order to be seen fasting by men. It's not the fast that's important, it's the motive behind it. When you fast, in other words, Jesus considered it quite likely and possible that his disciples would fast. That's not just in the Old Testament, this is for the New Testament. Fasting is something that Jesus considered his disciples would do in the New Testament. In Acts 13 we read of the early disciples fasting. And when you do fast, don't put on a gloomy face. Don't give an appearance, because then you're a hypocrite. Don't talk about it. Don't give a testimony concerning what God did when you fasted. Testify to what God did, but don't mention the fact that you fasted. And yet, there's something very subtle here. I have found that most believers who fast would like to let other people know about it, that they fasted for a week or 2 weeks, etc., and thereby directly disobey the commandment of Jesus Christ here in Matthew 6, verse 16. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. In other words, there's a reward that comes from fasting. But we won't get it if we let other people know about our fasting. When you fast, Jesus said, anoint your head and wash your face. Verse 17. So that you may not be seen fasting by men, but by your Father who is in secret. We should not be seen fasting by men, but only by our Father in secret. Notice that emphasis right through in doing righteousness, in prayer, and in fasting. He says, if you do it to be seen by men, you get no reward for the righteousness done. You get no answer from God for that prayer, and you certainly get no reward for anything accomplished through that prayer, and you get no reward for your fasting. So if we are really interested in fasting in a way that would accomplish something for God's purposes, it's important that we keep it as secret as possible. And then your Father, who sees in secret, verse 18, will repay you. There is a reward for fasting. Obviously, those who have not fasted when they should have will not get that reward. But there is a reward for fasting when it is done, as we have considered in verses 9 and 10 of this chapter, for the glory of God, for the furtherance of His kingdom, for the hallowing of His name, for the fulfillment of His will, not for personal honor or glory. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. And in that spirit, when we fast, we shall discover that God does reward way beyond what we can ask or think. There are things that we can accomplish by prayer, but there are certain other things which we cannot accomplish by prayer alone if we do not fast. Fasting is also important and necessary. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it says about a husband and wife agreeing to fast for a certain period of time that they may give themselves to prayer. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 5, it says that you may devote yourself to prayer. They can fast, fasting from food, fasting from sex, fasting from many things that are legitimate. Fasting is a giving up of legitimate activity, denying ourselves of something physical that our body needs in order that we might devote ourselves to prayer. And Jesus mentioned, as I said earlier, that a certain type of demon could not be cast out, Matthew 17, except by prayer and fasting. There is no rule or law concerning fasting, or how often we should do it, or how frequently we should do it. And when people lay down laws for others, they become Pharisees, and they become Pharisee of the Pharisees to teach other people things that God has not taught. God gives us freedom. Each person must choose entirely according to his own will, whether he wants to fast or how often and for how long he should fast. Having said that, we can move on to the next section. We've been considering these wrong attitudes that Jesus warned His disciples against. And we've been considering in these first 18 verses this wrong attitude of seeking man's honor in righteousness, prayer, and fasting. We are not to seek man's honor. From there, we go on to verses 19 to 24 to deal with the love of money, which is another very important subject, a wrong attitude that we are to beware of, the love of money. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. How much is a treasure? Is 10,000 rupees a treasure, or 5,000 rupees, or 50,000 rupees? What did Jesus mean when He said, don't lay up for yourself treasure? Does it mean we shouldn't even have 50 rupees in our bank account? Is 50 rupees a treasure? It's very interesting that the New Testament doesn't lay down a limit. And any limit laid down there would have been no value with inflation going up and decreasing the value of money. And therefore we see here that it's for each person to decide for himself how much is treasure and how much is necessity. A certain amount of saving in a bank may be a necessity for some to provide for certain emergency needs. Since 99.9% of believers may not have the faith to live without any bank account, they should live at the level of their faith and have some savings so that they are not forced to beg or borrow in their time of need. But how much is to be determined by each individual himself, and one cannot judge another. But the principle lies applicable for every believer. Do not lay up treasure for yourself on earth, where moth and rust destroy. If your treasure is on earth, Jesus said in verse 20, your heart will be on earth too. How do you know where your heart is? We can find out by that which we give most of our thought to. For example, when a young man is in love with a young lady, he thinks often about her. His heart is indicated by the fact that he thinks often about her. And when you're often thinking about money and how to make more money, you can be pretty sure that your heart is set on money. And that is an indication that you have treasure way beyond your needs if you're on earth. And when we lay up treasure on earth, it is almost impossible to lay up treasure in heaven. So here is an exhortation that we need to take seriously if we are to come to a truly spiritual life.